Talk more about this. Avi Mayer, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, joins us now. Good to have you with us, sir. It's not just about 3 days of protest. It's also about calls for a general strike that we've seen across Israel too. It arguably is the most intense pressure that the government and Prime Minister Netanyahu has faced. Does it move the needle and does it sway him to change his position? Because what we've seen and talked about already is an appearance of doubling down on his decision to stand by the terms.
Well, Julia, I think tensions and emotions are as high in Israel today as they've ever been at any point in this war. The sense of grief is profound. Those six hostages had become household names in Israel. Of course, many around the world are familiar with the name of Goldberg Poland, who is an American Israeli whose parents were, I think, some of the most visible advocates on behalf of the hostages. But the five others were also extremely well known within Israel. And so the emotions are extremely real and extremely raw at this moment. As you saw, there have been hundreds of thousands of people swarming the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and other cities. And I think the pressure is becoming extremely, extremely strong. I don't know how the prime minister can really withstand it for very long. And I think that even his coalition members, those who are perhaps most disinclined to approving some kind of a deal at this point under the current terms, will be hard pressed not to go forward with some kind of a deal at some point in the very near future.
I mean, Avi, he's been under this kind of pressure before, though, arguably from allies like the United States, from governing coalition partners, from his own security officials that have said, particularly where we're talking about the Philadelphia corridor, that there are alternatives to policing this militarily. Is this the turning point, perhaps, that you're suggesting it might be?
Look, I think the United States and other mediators are reaching their own breaking point. They're also intensely frustrated with the inability of the parties to reach some kind of agreement for the entire length of time. The United States and others have said that Hamas has been the primary obstacle. I think that remains the case, but I think they do want the prime minister to be more forthcoming and perhaps for him to listen to those of his military chiefs who say, yes, it is a challenge. We do not want Hamas to be able to smuggle in weapons and individuals and money as they did prior to October 7th, which is what enabled them to carry out the October 7th massacre. But we have ways of handling that. And what the most important thing, the priority right now really needs to be bringing back as many of those hostages alive as we possibly can. I think he is starting to hear those voices. We've heard even in the past hour or so that there is some flexibility, that the Israeli negotiators are expressing some flexibility on the Philadelphia corridor. The question is whether it will be enough.
Critics have long pointed out or viewed Prime Minister Netanyahu's stance post-October the 7th as being prioritising his own political survival versus the survival of the hostages in question or the outcome of what we see as a result of what happened on October 7th. Do you think the protests will continue and perhaps that becomes the tipping point for him to look at other options and say, fine, OK, perhaps troops don't have to remain there. We can police this, to your point, differently. Do the protests push him there?
Well, I think there was a notable moment earlier today when it was announced that the leaders of the hostage family movement have actually partnered with the leaders of the movement that was trying to unseat the prime minister prior to October 7th in light of the government's attempt to push forward a judicial review just 1 year ago. And that, I think, may be the brew that actually does bring that pressure to bear and does make him consider whether this is a direction he needs to pursue. Ultimately, I don't think the prime minister is opposed to the notion of a hostage deal. I think he understands that is the only way that as many hostages as possible are going to be brought home. Yes, we've had those heroic rescue missions that have brought a certain number of them home alive, but we know that that's not going to bring back the bulk of them. He recognizes that. The leaders of the military and the defense establishment realize that. It's a matter of figuring out what terms we can get, how Israel can ensure that its own basic security needs are met in the context of any kind of agreement. It looks like we're almost there. Let's hope we get there in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, your point is it's not just about signing some kind of hostage and ceasefire deal, as important as that is. It's about what path that leads to in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think many of those who are opposed to the deal under the current terms are deeply concerned, for example, about the number of Palestinian terrorists who would be released as part of a deal. They look, for example, at Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, the mastermind behind the October 7th massacre, who was himself released as part of a previous deal in order to secure the return of an Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit. He was one of 1,000 Palestinian terrorists released at that time. And many of the critics of the proposed deal look at that and say, how can we risk that happening again? How can we risk this large number of terrorists returning to terrorist activity and perhaps trying to perpetrate a massacre like October 7th again? So these are very real concerns. The question is which concern wins out at this point, and which risk is the one that is I think, most important to take at this time. I think most of Israel would say the immediate priority needs to be to bring back those hostages. We'll deal with the security concerns and those long-term ramifications after they're brought home.
But your balance and the context is desperately needed at a moment of high emotion. Avi, great to have you with us. Thank you, sir.